Ezra Thompson froze mid-swing, his axe suspended above the firewood as the echo of desperate knocking shattered 31 years of silence. The sound wasn't wind against weathered wood. It was human knuckles, raw and urgent, pounding against his cabin door at midnight. 10 Choctaw women stood in the swirling snow, their faces hollowed by starvation, eyes reflecting the amber glow of his lantern like wounded animals seeking sanctuary. The eldest woman collapsed against his doorframe, her final breath misting in the frigid air as she whispered something in her native tongue before going still. Abigail Crow. Feather stepped forward, cradling a blue-lipped infant against her chest, and spoke words that would unravel everything he thought he knew about forgiveness. "We know who you are, soldier. We know what you did to our people at Sand Creek." Her voice carried no hatred, only exhaustion. "But tonight, we choose to trust the man who saved my life 30 years ago." The baby's weak cry pierced the mountain silence. How long before the bounty hunters found them? How long before his past finally claimed its due? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Colorado Territory stretched endless and unforgiving in the spring of 1882, where men carved their lives from stone and silence. Ezra Thompson had chosen this isolation deliberately, building his ranch 3 hours' hard ride from the nearest settlement of Millbrook. At 67, his weathered hands told stories of war and loss. Arthritic fingers that had once pulled triggers now struggled with simple tasks like milking his lone cow or mending fence posts. Widow's Rest Ranch sat perched on a natural shelf of granite, overlooking a valley where morning mist clung to pine trees like ghosts reluctant to leave. The log cabin bore the scars of 3 decades: patched roof, reinforced door, windows that had witnessed too much sorrow. Behind the house, a small cemetery held 3 wooden crosses, each carved with trembling hands during the darkest hours of his life. Sarah Thompson, 1851 to 1855, died in childbirth along with their son, leaving Ezra's first attempt at happiness buried in frozen ground. Rebecca Thompson, 1857 to 1863. Pneumonia took her during a winter so brutal that Ezra couldn't dig her grave until spring thaw. Martha Thompson, 1865 to 1879. The cross simply read, "Beloved Wife." Ezra had never been able to carve the word accident after her name, because deep in his gut, he'd always suspected it wasn't. Each morning, Ezra carried his coffee to Martha's grave and spoke to the mountain air as if she might answer. "Getting harder to remember your voice," he'd whisper, watching his breath fog in the thin air. "Sometimes I wonder if you're the lucky one, leaving all this mess behind." The war had followed him home like a plague. Sand Creek haunted his dreams. The sound of cavalry charges, the screams of women and children, the sight of his commanding officer's face twisted with bloodlust. Ezra had disobeyed direct orders that day, pulling survivors from burning lodges while his regiment continued the slaughter. The court-martial came swift and merciless. Dishonorable discharge, all records sealed, his reputation destroyed. Now he survived on a meager pension, supplemented by occasional cattle sales and his small vegetable garden. Beans, hardtack, and whiskey comprised most meals. The isolation suited him, or so he told himself during the long winter nights when loneliness pressed against his chest like a physical weight. The ranch showed signs of neglect. Fence posts leaned at dangerous angles, the barn roof sagged under accumulated snow damage, and weeds choked the path to the well. At 67, Ezra moved with the careful deliberation of a man whose body had endured too much. His left leg, shattered by Confederate shrapnel at Gettysburg, ached constantly in the thin mountain air. 31 winters, he muttered to himself while chopping firewood, counting each year since Martha's death. 31 winters of talking to the wind and expecting answers. He paused, axe balanced in his grip, and looked toward the valley where storm clouds gathered like dark promises. Something in the air felt different today, charged with possibility or danger, he couldn't tell which. The blizzard struck without warning on March 15th, transforming the familiar landscape into a white hell of driving snow and howling wind. Ezra had seen storms before, but this one carried the fury of winter's last stand against spring's advance. He battened down the ranch, securing loose boards and bringing his horse into the barn, expecting to wait out nature's tantrum alone as he had countless times before. The knocking came at midnight, so desperate and urgent that it cut through the storm's roar like a knife through canvas. Ezra's hand instinctively reached for the shotgun beside his chair. 31 years of solitude had taught him that unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. But the rhythm wasn't threatening. It was pleading, the sound of knuckles raw from cold and desperation. When he opened the heavy wooden door, the sight that greeted him defied everything he thought he knew about his isolated world. 10 women stood in his doorway, their faces gaunt with starvation and exhaustion, snow clinging to their dark hair like crystalline tears. They wore a mixture of traditional Choctaw clothing and threadbare blankets, their breath forming desperate clouds in the frigid air. At the front of the group stood a woman who appeared to be in her mid-40s, her eyes holding a strength that neither hunger nor cold could diminish. She cradled something precious against her chest, a bundle that moved with the weak rhythm of labored breathing. Behind her, an elderly woman leaned heavily on 2 younger companions, her face gray with the pallor of approaching death. "Please," the leader said, her English careful but clear. "We have nowhere else to go. Grace Singing Bird is dying, and the baby—" She pulled back a corner of the blanket, revealing an infant whose lips had turned an alarming shade of blue. "We've been walking for 5 days. The storm caught us in the open." Ezra's mind reeled, caught between instinct and terror. These weren't random travelers, they were Choctaw, and their presence at his door couldn't be coincidence. His past had finally tracked him down, arriving in the form of 10 desperate women seeking shelter from a man who had once been their people's enemy. "I can't," he started, but the words died in his throat as the elderly woman, Grace Singing Bird, collapsed against the doorframe. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and when she looked up at Ezra, recognition flickered in her failing eyes. She whispered something in Choctaw, words that carried the weight of memory and forgiveness. The leader stepped forward, her gaze never leaving Ezra's face. "My name is Abigail Crowfeather. I know who you are, Ezra Thompson. I know about Sand Creek, about what your regiment did to my people. But I also know about the soldier who disobeyed orders that day, who pulled children from burning lodges while his fellow soldiers continued the killing." The baby's cry pierced the night air, weak and thready, but still fighting for life. Ezra saw his own infant son in that tiny face, the child who had died with Sarah 31 years ago, the loss that had started his long descent into isolation and self-punishment. "The territorial authorities declared us outlaws," Abigail continued, snow swirling around her words. "They say we're witches, that we've been practicing dark magic and defrauding landowners. It's all lies, but lies with government backing are as good as truth. There's a bounty on our heads, $50 for each woman returned to custody." Grace Singing Bird's breathing grew more labored, and one of the younger women, barely more than a girl, began to weep silently. The sound cut through Ezra's defenses like nothing had in decades. Here was human suffering at his doorstep, and for once in his miserable existence he had the power to help instead of harm. "The storm," Abigail said quietly, her eyes pleading despite her proud bearing. "Grace won't survive another hour in this cold, And the baby. She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew that infants didn't last long in such conditions. Ezra looked past the group of women into the swirling darkness beyond his porch. Somewhere out there, bounty hunters and territorial marshals were probably searching for these refugees, following a trail that the storm would soon erase. Taking them in would mean painting a target on his own back, involving himself in troubles that could cost him everything he'd built in 31 years of careful isolation. But as Grace Singing Bird drew what might be her final breath, as the baby's cries grew weaker, Ezra felt something crack inside his chest, not his heart breaking, but a wall he'd built around it finally crumbling under the weight of human need. "Get them inside," he said, stepping back from the door. "We'll sort out the rest come morning." As the women filed past him into the warmth of his cabin, bringing with them the scent of wood smoke and prairie wind, Ezra realized that his 31 years of solitude had just come to an end. Grace Singing Bird died as the dawn light crept through the cabin windows, her final breath escaping like a whispered prayer in the language of her ancestors. Ezra had sat vigil beside her makeshift bed, watching the elderly woman's face relax into the peace that had eluded her during those last desperate days on the trail. Abigail knelt beside the body, her weathered hands closing Grace's eyes while speaking words in Choctaw that carried the weight of generations. "She said you would understand," Abigail whispered to Ezra as the other women gathered around their fallen elder. "She remembered you from Sand Creek. You carried her granddaughter to safety that day." The revelation hit Ezra like a physical blow, memories flooding back of a terrified child with Grace's same dark eyes, clinging to his uniform as he ran through smoke and chaos. The burial took place in the small cemetery behind the cabin, where Ezra's 3 wives rested beneath weathered crosses. Despite the frozen ground, he and the younger women managed to dig a proper grave, their breath forming clouds in the cold air as they worked in respectful silence. Abigail conducted the ceremony in both Choctaw and broken English, her voice carrying across the mountain wind as she honored Grace's journey to the spirit world. That evening, as the women settled into the cramped cabin, Abigail explained their desperate circumstances. The territorial government had declared them outlaws based on fabricated charges of witchcraft and land fraud, accusations that served as convenient pretexts for removing them from valuable territory that white settlers coveted. Their men had been arrested or killed, their children scattered to government schools, their homes burned to ensure they could never return. "We have 30 days, Abigail said, warming her hands over the fire that Ezra had built higher than it had burned in years. 30 days to find permanent settlement or face capture and imprisonment. The bounty hunters are already tracking us. $50 per woman is more money than most men see in a year." Ezra found himself studying the faces around his hearth, each woman carrying her own story of loss and displacement. Mary White Dove, young and pregnant, had been struck mute by trauma after witnessing her husband's execution. Ruth Standing Bear, barely 16 but fierce as winter wind, appointed herself protector of the group's younger members. Clara Morning Star, a skilled healer in her 30s, tended to various injuries and ailments with knowledge passed down through generations. The arrangement they negotiated was simple. The women would help with ranch work in exchange for shelter and protection. Ezra needed the assistance. His arthritic hands struggled with daily tasks, and the ranch showed years of neglect. The women needed time to plan their next move and recover their strength. It seemed like a practical solution to mutual problems, but on the 3rd day, Sheriff William Blackwood arrived with his deputy, their horses stamping impatiently in the muddy yard as melting snow revealed the brown earth beneath. Blackwood was a man who wore authority like an expensive coat, his badge polished and his bearing suggesting someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation rather than law. "Morning, Thompson," Blackwood called from his saddle, his eyes scanning the cabin for signs of recent habitation. "Had reports of suspicious activity up this way. Smoke from your chimney's been mighty regular lately for a man who usually keeps to himself." Ezra stepped onto his porch, shotgun cradled casually in his arms, not quite threatening, but certainly not welcoming. "Property's mine, Sheriff. I'll burn what I please when I please." "Course you will," Blackwood agreed, his smile never reaching his eyes. "But we're hunting some dangerous fugitives, Indian women who've been stirring up trouble down in the territory. Territorial Marshal thinks they might be headed this direction looking for sympathizers or places to hide." The cabin behind Ezra remained silent, but he could feel 10 pairs of eyes watching through cracks in the shutters. The women had prepared for this moment, hiding their few possessions and rehearsing their story. But discovery would mean death, or worse, for all of them. "Haven't seen nobody," Ezra said flatly. "You boys are welcome to look around, but you won't find nothing but an old man and his loneliness." Blackwood's deputy, a nervous young man named Peterson, shifted in his saddle. "Sheriff, if Thompson says they ain't here—" "Thompson's word ain't worth much in this county," Blackwood interrupted, his voice carrying a edge that hadn't been there moments before. "Man who got drummed out of the army for cowardice, who let 3 wives die on his watch, that ain't exactly what I'd call reliable testimony." The insult about his wives hit Ezra like a physical blow, but he forced himself to remain calm. Blackwood was fishing, trying to provoke a reaction that would justify a search. Instead, Ezra lowered his shotgun and stepped aside. "Search all you want," he said quietly, "but when you're done finding nothing, I want you off my property, and I don't want to see you back here without a warrant." Blackwood studied Ezra's face for a long moment, clearly surprised by the invitation. After a tense minute, he wheeled his horse around. "This ain't over, Thompson. Those women are worth $500 to the right people, and I mean to collect. When they turn up, and they will turn up, I'll remember who helped them." As the lawmen rode away, Ezra realized that his quiet life of solitude and self-imposed penance had just become infinitely more complicated. The past had indeed found him, but not in the way he'd expected. The weeks that followed Grace's burial transformed Widow's Rest Ranch in ways Ezra could never have imagined. What had begun as temporary shelter evolved into something resembling a functioning community, with each woman contributing skills that breathed new life into the neglected property. The silence that had defined 31 years of solitude gave way to the sounds of industry, conversation, and something Ezra had almost forgotten existed: laughter. Clara Morningstar proved to be a miracle worker with her herbal remedies, curing Ezra's chronic arthritis pain with willow bark tea and treating his persistent cough with a concoction that tasted terrible but worked better than any store-bought medicine. Ruth Standing Bear, despite her youth, possessed an uncanny ability with livestock, coaxing milk from Ezra's stubborn cow and somehow convincing his ornery horse to accept a saddle without the usual 20-minute battle. Mary White Dove, though still mute from trauma, communicated through gestures and expressions that spoke volumes. She tended to the vegetable garden with an almost mystical understanding of which plants would thrive in the Rocky Mountain soil. Her pregnancy progressed steadily, and watching her nurture both growing plants and the life within her gave Ezra a sense of hope he hadn't felt since Sarah's time. The transformation wasn't merely practical, it was emotional. For the first time in decades, Ezra found himself looking forward to sunrise instead of dreading another day of empty routine. The women taught him phrases in Choctaw while he helped them improve their English. Evening meals became community gatherings where stories were shared, plans were made, and the boundaries between cultures began to blur. But peace in the Colorado Territory was as fragile as spring ice, and by mid-April the first cracks began to show. Children in the settlement started falling ill with symptoms that Clara's remedies couldn't touch: violent stomach pains, fever, and a strange rash that appeared overnight. When Mary White Dove began experiencing the same symptoms, Ezra knew they faced a crisis that threatened everything they'd built. The source of the illness revealed itself when Ruth discovered dead fish floating in the stream that fed their well. The water had taken on a metallic taste that Ezra had attributed to spring runoff, but testing revealed something far more sinister. Someone had been deliberately contaminating their water supply with mine tailings, poisoning the source that kept their small community alive. Investigation led Ezra to the abandoned Silver Creek mine, officially closed for 3 years but showing signs of recent activity. Fresh excavation scars marked the hillside above their ranch, and chemical runoff channeled directly toward their water source. The operation bore all the hallmarks of illegal mining, the kind that ignored environmental consequences in pursuit of quick profits. When Ezra confronted the Territorial Mining Office in Millbrook, he discovered that Sheriff Blackwood's brother-in-law had quietly purchased mineral rights to the entire valley, including areas that should have been protected watershed. The poisoning wasn't accidental; it was a calculated effort to force Ezra off his land by making it uninhabitable. The revelation forced a desperate trip to town for medical assistance. Dr. Samuel Morrison, a decent man struggling with the prejudices of his time, initially refused to treat Indian patients. But when Ezra threatened to expose Morrison's own illegal activities, performing abortions for wealthy families while publicly condemning the practice, the doctor agreed to help under cover of darkness. Morrison's treatment saved Mary and the other victims, but his involvement came with warnings about greater dangers ahead. "Blackwood's not just after those women," Morrison confided as he packed his medical bag. "He's been asking questions about your property, about mineral surveys and railroad routes. That land of yours is worth more than you know, Ezra." The truth emerged gradually through conversations with sympathetic townspeople and careful observation of increased activity around the ranch. The proposed transcontinental railroad extension would pass directly through Ezra's valley, making his property incredibly valuable to the right investors. Blackwood represented a consortium of businessmen who had been quietly acquiring land along the projected route, using any means necessary to force out stubborn holdouts. The Choctaw women weren't just convenient scapegoats. They were the perfect excuse to declare Ezra an Indian sympathizer whose property could be seized under territorial security laws. By harboring fugitives, Ezra had unknowingly given his enemies the legal justification they needed to take everything he owned. As spring progressed into early summer, the pressure mounted from multiple directions. Federal Marshal James Crawford arrived from Denver with official papers demanding the surrender of the Choctaw fugitives for transport to reservations in Oklahoma. Unlike Blackwood, Crawford seemed genuinely troubled by his orders, but made it clear that federal authority superseded any local arrangements. "I've got nothing personal against these women," Crawford told Ezra during a tense meeting on the ranch porch. "But the territorial governor wants this situation resolved, and Washington's breathing down everybody's necks about Indian policy. Give them up voluntarily, and I'll make sure they're treated decently during transport." The offer forced Ezra to confront the fundamental question that had been building since that first desperate night. How far was he willing to go to protect people who had become more than refugees? They had become family. Abigail, in particular, had awakened feelings in him that he'd thought died with Martha. Their evening conversations had evolved from practical discussions about ranch work to intimate sharing of dreams, fears, and the growing attraction neither was willing to acknowledge openly. The romantic tension reached a breaking point one evening in late May, when Abigail found Ezra sitting by Martha's grave, struggling with the impossible choice between surrender and resistance. She sat beside him in comfortable silence before speaking the words that changed everything between them. "She would have loved this," Abigail said, gesturing toward the lights in the cabin windows where the other women were teaching Ruth to read. "Martha, I found her journal in the kitchen drawer. She wrote about wanting to help displaced people, about feeling guilty for the comfortable life she had while others suffered." Ezra stared at the grave marker, realizing that protecting the Choctaw women might be exactly what Martha would have wanted. "I loved her," he said quietly. "Still do. But loving the dead ain't the same as living for them." "No," Abigail agreed, her hand finding his in the gathering dusk. "Sometimes loving the dead means learning to love the living again." Their first kiss happened beside Martha's grave, and rather than feeling like betrayal, it felt like benediction, as if Martha herself was giving them permission to find happiness in each other's arms. That night, for the first time in 31 years, Ezra didn't feel like he was merely surviving until his own death. He felt like he was living towards something worth protecting. But love couldn't shield them from the escalating threats. Bounty hunters began circling the property like wolves, taking photographs and mapping escape routes. Cattle were found shot and left to rot, a clear message about what would happen to anyone who stood in the way of progress. The illegal mining operation expanded, poisoning more of the watershed and making their position increasingly desperate. The financial pressure proved equally devastating. Medical bills from treating the poisoning victims consumed most of Ezra's savings. Property taxes, mysteriously reassessed at triple their previous rate, threatened foreclosure. When Blackwood arrived with an offer to purchase the ranch for $2,000, generous money that would solve all of Ezra's immediate problems, the temptation was almost overwhelming. "Think about it, Thompson," Blackwood said, his tone reasonable despite the underlying threat. "You're an old man with no heirs, no future except whatever years you got left. That money would set you up comfortable in California or Oregon, somewhere warm where your bones won't ache every winter. These women will be rounded up eventually whether you help them or not. Why sacrifice everything for people who can't even legally exist in this territory?" That night, the women gathered to vote on their collective future. Some advocated fleeing deeper into the mountains, living as outlaws until the political situation changed. Others favored attempting to reach Canada, where they might find sanctuary among other refugee tribes. A few, led by Clara, suggested negotiating surrender in exchange for guarantees of humane treatment. Abigail alone advocated for staying and fighting, despite the overwhelming odds against them. "This land has become our home," she said, her voice carrying the authority of natural leadership. "If we run now, we'll spend the rest of our lives running. If we surrender, we'll spend whatever years remain as prisoners of people who see us as less than human. I say we make our stand here with the man who's proven himself our friend." The vote split evenly, leaving the decision to Ezra himself. Standing in his cabin, surrounded by women who had transformed his empty existence into something meaningful, he realized that the choice wasn't really about them, it was about who he chose to be in the time he had left. "We stay," he said simply, "and we fight." The siege of Widow's Rest Ranch began at dawn on July 1st, when Sheriff Blackwood arrived with 12 armed men and Federal Marshal Crawford bearing official papers that sealed their fate. The morning mist still clung to the valley floor as the posse positioned themselves around the property, their rifles glinting in the early sunlight like promises of violence to come. Ezra stood on his porch, shotgun cradled in his arms, watching the systematic deployment of forces that would determine whether his makeshift family lived or died. Behind him, the cabin had been transformed into a fortress over the preceding weeks. Windows were reinforced with furniture, ammunition was distributed to every woman capable of firing a weapon, and escape routes had been planned down to the smallest detail. "Thompson!" Blackwood's voice carried across the yard with the authority of a man accustomed to obedience. You've got 10 minutes to surrender those fugitives and yourself. After that, we come in shooting, and whatever happens is on your head." The ultimatum hung in the mountain air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Inside the cabin, Ezra could hear the quiet movements of women checking weapons and whispering final prayers in languages that had echoed through these mountains long before any white man claimed ownership of the land. Mary White Dove, now visibly pregnant and due within weeks, sat in the root cellar with the elderly women, protected by walls of stone and determination. Abigail appeared at Ezra's shoulder, her rifle held with the competence of someone who had learned to shoot out of necessity rather than sport. 31 years you've been preparing for this moment," she said quietly. "Every day of solitude, every night of guilt. It all led here to this choice between who you were and who you can become." "I spent 31 years running from who I was," Ezra replied, his voice carrying across the morning stillness. "Today I stand and fight for who I choose to be." The first shots came not from Blackwood's men, but from the forest beyond the ranch, where Ruth Standing Bear and 2 of the younger women had positioned themselves as snipers. The sound of rifle fire shattered the tense silence, followed immediately by shouts of confusion and anger from the attacking force. Ruth's first bullet took down Blackwood's deputy, Peterson, while her companions created the illusion of a much larger defensive force hidden in the trees. Blackwood's response was swift and brutal. His men opened fire on the cabin from 3 directions, their bullets splintering wood and shattering windows in a sustained barrage designed to force surrender through overwhelming firepower. But Ezra's defensive preparations proved their worth. The women had created firing positions that allowed them to return accurate shots while remaining protected from return fire. The battle raged through the morning with neither side gaining decisive advantage. Clara Morningstar had established a medical station in the barn, treating wounds with the same calm efficiency she brought to healing arthritis and fever. Her steady hands saved the life of one of the townspeople who had joined their cause. Dr. Morrison had arrived during the night with 3 other men who couldn't stomach the idea of armed men attacking women and children. As the sun climbed higher, the tactical situation began to shift in favor of the defenders. Ruth's guerrilla attacks from the forest forced Blackwood to split his forces, reducing the pressure on the main cabin. The women proved to be excellent marksmen, their shots carefully aimed and devastatingly effective. More importantly, the sounds of battle had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The first sign of changing fortunes came when a group of local miners arrived, armed and angry about the illegal mining operation that had been poisoning their water sources downstream. These men had no love for Choctaw refugees, but they hated corporate exploitation even more. Their leader, a grizzled Irishman named Sean O'Brien, spat tobacco juice and declared his intentions with typical bluntness. "Ain't fighting for no Indians," O'Brien announced as his men took positions alongside the defenders. "But I'll be damned if I let some railroad bastard steal honest men's water for their profit schemes." The arrival of the miners coincided with an even more surprising development. A group of Ute warriors appeared on the ridge above the ranch, their presence announced by war cries that echoed through the valley like ghosts of ancient conflicts. These traditional enemies of the Choctaw had apparently decided that the greater threat came from white authorities who made no distinction between tribes when it came to removal and extinction. Federal Marshal Crawford, already uncomfortable with his orders, found himself in an impossible position as the conflict escalated beyond a simple arrest operation into what was beginning to resemble a genuine battle. When one of Blackwood's men shot an unarmed Ute messenger carrying a white flag, Crawford made the decision that would define the rest of his career. "Cease fire!" Crawford shouted, his voice carrying the authority of federal law. "I'm suspending this operation pending investigation of illegal mining activities and violations of territorial sovereignty." Blackwood's response revealed the true nature of the forces arrayed against Ezra and his community. Drawing his sidearm, the sheriff aimed not at the cabin but at Crawford himself. "You federal boys been getting in the way of progress too long. Time somebody taught you about respecting local authority." The confrontation between Blackwood and Crawford created a momentary pause in the battle, long enough for the most dramatic reversal of the entire siege. Ruth Standing Bear, using skills learned during her people's long resistance to removal, had worked her way through the forest to a position directly behind Blackwood's command post. Her rifle shot, aimed with the precision of desperation and perfect timing, struck Blackwood in the shoulder just as he was about to shoot Crawford. The sheriff's wound wasn't mortal, but the psychological impact of being shot by a 16-year-old Choctaw girl broke something fundamental in his authority. His men, already rattled by the unexpected opposition and questionable legality of their mission, began to waver. When Dr. Morrison emerged from the cabin carrying a white cloth and shouting demands for medical attention for the wounded, the battle effectively ended. But victory came with a terrible price that would haunt Ezra for the rest of his days. During the confusion of the final confrontation, one of Blackwood's men, a young gunslinger looking to make his reputation, had flanked around to the back of the cabin where Mary White Dove was helping to evacuate the elderly women from the root cellar. His shot, aimed at what he thought was an armed defender, struck Mary in the abdomen. The sound of Mary's scream cut through the mountain air like nothing Ezra had ever heard. By the time he reached her, Clara was already working desperately to stop the bleeding, her hands red with the blood of a woman who had survived everything the territorial government could inflict, only to be struck down at the moment of victory. Mary White Dove died as the sun set behind the mountains, her hand clasped in Ezra's while Abigail sang traditional Choctaw death songs in a voice broken by grief. The baby she carried, a child who might have represented hope for the future, died with her, taking with them dreams of continuity and renewal that had sustained the community through its darkest hours. The aftermath of the battle brought official vindication but personal devastation. Federal investigators, led by Marshal Crawford, uncovered evidence of the illegal mining operation and the conspiracy to steal Ezra's land through fraudulent legal proceedings. Blackwood was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including the murder of Martha Thompson 3 years earlier, a crime discovered through documents found in his office safe. But legal victory felt hollow as Ezra stood beside Mary's grave, the fourth cross in his family cemetery. The young woman who had taught him that love could transcend racial boundaries, that hope could survive the worst trauma, lay buried in soil that had been consecrated by too much innocent blood. "She believed we could build something better," Abigail said, her hand finding Ezra's as they watched the sun disappear behind the peaks. "Mary saw the future we're fighting for, a place where children could grow up without fear, where different peoples could become one family." The battle was won, but the war for their community's soul was just beginning. The victory at Widow's Rest Ranch crumbled like autumn leaves in the weeks that followed Mary White Dove's funeral. What should have been a celebration of triumph over corruption and injustice became instead a descent into grief so profound that it threatened to destroy everything they had fought to protect. Ezra took Mary's death harder than anyone expected, retreating into the same isolation that had defined his existence before the women's arrival. He spent hours sitting beside her grave, a bottle of whiskey, his only companion as he struggled with the terrible arithmetic of violence. How many innocents had to die for his choices? How many crosses would he carve before his own story ended? "I'm a magnet for death," he told Martha's weathered headstone during one of his drunken vigils. "Everyone I try to protect ends up in the ground. Sarah, Rebecca, you, and now Mary." Maybe Blackwood was right. Maybe some men ain't meant to have families. The whiskey became his escape from responsibility, his shield against the accusing eyes of the surviving women who had trusted him to keep them safe. Abigail found him unconscious in the barn one morning, surrounded by empty bottles and the stench of his own despair. When she tried to help him to his feet, he pushed her away with violence that shocked them both. "Don't touch me!" he snarled, his words slurred by alcohol and self-loathing. "I ain't worth saving, and anyone fool enough to try ends up dead." The community that had flourished under adversity began to fracture under the weight of their leader's breakdown. Without Ezra's steady presence, old tensions surfaced among the women. Some blamed him for Mary's death, arguing that surrender would have saved their sister's life. Others defended his choices while privately wondering if their sanctuary had become a trap. Ruth Standing Bear, barely 17 but aged beyond her years by violence, appointed herself the community's protector in Ezra's absence. She organized patrols, managed the ranch's daily operations, and tried to hold together a group of women who were beginning to question whether their mountain refuge was worth the blood it had cost. "He saved us," Ruth insisted during one particularly bitter argument about their future. "Whatever he's become now, Ezra Thompson pulled us from the snow and gave us hope when we had nothing left." But hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. The legal victory over Blackwood's conspiracy had come with devastating financial costs. Legal fees consumed what little money Ezra had saved, while medical expenses from treating the wounded drained their remaining resources. The ranch's livestock had been scattered or killed during the battle, and crop damage left them facing a hungry winter with empty stores. More troubling was the news that arrived with Dr. Morrison's weekly visits. The territorial government, embarrassed by the exposure of corruption in their ranks, was pushing through new legislation that would make harboring displaced persons a federal crime. The women's legal status remained precarious, and rumors suggested that federal marshals would soon arrive with orders that even sympathetic officials like Crawford couldn't ignore. The breaking point came in early August when a letter arrived from the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. Abigail's distant relatives, hearing of her situation through the network of tribal communications, offered sanctuary for any Choctaw women willing to relocate to the established reservation. The offer included safe passage, guaranteed housing, and legal protection under federal treaty obligations. For the first time since their arrival, the women had a genuine alternative to their mountain exile. The debate that followed split the community down the middle, with Clara Morningstar leading those who favored accepting the Cherokee offer, while Ruth rallied supporters for staying and fighting. "We came here to be free," Ruth argued with the passionate intensity of youth. "Reservations ain't freedom. They're just prettier prisons where they can watch us die slowly instead of shooting us quickly." Clara, older and more pragmatic, countered with the harsh mathematics of survival. "Freedom don't mean nothing if we're dead. That Cherokee land is legal sanctuary, and we could rebuild our lives without looking over our shoulders every day." The deadlock forced them to confront the question they had all been avoiding. What was Ezra's role in their future? His drinking had worsened to the point where he was barely functional, and his guilt-driven withdrawal had left them effectively leaderless at the moment they most needed guidance. Abigail, torn between love and duty, made the painful decision to force a confrontation. She found Ezra in his usual position beside Mary's grave, cradling an empty bottle and muttering apologies to the dead. This time, instead of trying to comfort him, she spoke with the unforgiving clarity of someone who had exhausted her patience. "You want to drink yourself to death? Fine, but you don't get to take the rest of us with you." Her words cut through his alcoholic haze like a blade. "Mary died believing in something bigger than her own pain. You're spitting on her grave every time you reach for that bottle." Ezra looked up at her with eyes that had lost their focus and most of their hope. She'd be alive if I'd let you all go. Sarah would be alive, Rebecca, Martha. They'd all be alive if I wasn't so damned selfish, always thinking I could protect people who'd be better off without me. Maybe, Abigail agreed, her voice softening slightly. Or maybe they'd be dead anyway, just somewhere else, forgotten by people who never bothered to love them enough to fight for them. That evening, the community gathered for what everyone understood might be their final meeting at Widow's Rest Ranch. 6 of the women had decided to accept the Cherokee offer, while 4 chose to remain regardless of the consequences. The group that had arrived as 10 desperate refugees was fragmenting into smaller pieces, each seeking their own path to survival. The farewells were tearful but not bitter. These women had shared too much hardship to part in anger, even when they disagreed about the future. As the departing group prepared for their journey to Oklahoma, they left behind more than just memories. They left a community forever changed by loss, and the recognition that even the strongest bonds could not guarantee survival in an unforgiving world. Abigail stood at the crossroads between duty and desire, holding travel papers that would guarantee her safety, but separate her forever from the man she had come to love. The Cherokee delegation would leave in the morning, and she had until dawn to make the choice that would define the rest of her life. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the cemetery where too many dreams lay buried, Ezra sat alone on his porch, finally sober enough to understand what his grief was about to cost him. The revelation that would change everything came not through dramatic confrontation or sudden inspiration, but through the quiet desperation of a woman preparing to leave the only man she had ever truly loved. Abigail spent her final night at Widow's Rest Ranch packing the few possessions she had accumulated during her months of sanctuary, her hands moving mechanically through tasks while her heart wrestled with the impossible choice between safety and devotion. As she folded the simple dress that Clara had sewn for her from fabric bought during their one trip to Millbrook, her fingers discovered something unexpected. A loose board in the bottom of Martha's old wardrobe where she had been storing her belongings. Beneath that board lay a leather portfolio tied with ribbon, hidden so carefully that it had escaped discovery during 31 years of Ezra's occupancy. The documents inside the portfolio would have seemed mundane to most observers: property deeds, legal correspondence, and a last will and testament written in Martha Thompson's careful handwriting. But as Abigail read through the papers by candlelight, their implications struck her like physical blows. Martha Thompson had been far more than the simple rancher's wife that Ezra remembered. She had been secretly wealthy, the sole heir to oil-rich Texas land that her father had acquired before his death. The will, dated just weeks before Martha's death, bequeathed her entire estate, valued at over $50,000, to a trust fund for the protection and assistance of displaced indigenous peoples and other refugees seeking sanctuary in the American territories. More shocking still was the appointment of Ezra Thompson as the trust's administrator, with full authority to distribute funds according to his conscience and the needs he encountered. But the most devastating revelation came in Martha's personal letter, sealed and addressed to "my beloved husband, to be opened only in his darkest hour." Abigail's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal and read words that Martha had written as her own death approached. "My dearest Ezra, if you are reading this, then the darkness I have seen growing in our valley has finally claimed me, and you are facing trials that will test everything you believe about justice and mercy. I know about your nightmares, about the guilt you carry from Sand Creek, about your fear that you are cursed to bring death to everyone you love. You are not cursed, my darling. You are chosen. The same hands that pulled innocent children from burning lodges, that defied evil orders to save lives, are the hands that will someday offer sanctuary to others who have nowhere else to turn. I have seen this in my dreams, and I have prepared for it with every resource at my disposal. The money I leave behind is not charity. It is ammunition in a war against hatred and despair. Use it to build something that will outlast both of us, something that proves love is stronger than fear, that mercy can triumph over vengeance. Do not let my death become another burden of guilt. Let it become the foundation of redemption. The letter continued with specific instructions about how to access the trust funds and detailed plans for establishing a permanent sanctuary community. Martha had even corresponded secretly with sympathetic officials in Washington, laying groundwork for legal recognition that could protect future refugees from the arbitrary cruelties of territorial politics. Abigail found Ezra where she expected, slumped beside Mary's grave with an empty bottle at his feet, his weathered face streaked with tears that alcohol could no longer numb. But instead of the gentle approach she had used before, she dropped the portfolio in his lap with enough force to startle him into alertness. "Read it," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that cut through his drunken haze. "All of it. Every word your wife wrote while you were feeling sorry for yourself." As Ezra's eyes focused on Martha's handwriting, Abigail watched 31 years of guilt and self-recrimination crumble like walls built on shifting sand. The man who had believed himself cursed discovered that the woman he loved most had seen him as blessed. The soldier who had spent decades atoning for saving lives learned that his wife had died not as punishment for his sins, but as preparation for his redemption. "She knew," Ezra whispered, his voice breaking as he read about Martha's dreams of refugees finding sanctuary at their ranch. "She knew they would come, and she prepared for it. All these years I thought her death was my fault, but she was planning for this moment." The truth about Martha's death emerged as Ezra read through the legal correspondence. Sheriff Blackwood, serving as Martha's attorney, had discovered her plans and attempted to convince her to change the will. When she refused, he had murdered her to prevent the trust from being established, then hidden the documents while waiting for Ezra to die so that he could claim the land through fraudulent inheritance laws. "Blackwood killed her because she was going to help people like us," Abigail said, sitting beside Ezra in the graveyard that had defined so much of his pain. "She died for the same cause we've been fighting for, and you've been drinking yourself to death instead of honoring her sacrifice." The revelation transformed more than Ezra's understanding of the past. It provided a roadmap for the future that neither of them had dared to imagine. With $50,000 and legal documentation predating the current anti-refugee legislation, they could establish a permanent sanctuary community with federal protection. The women who had left for Cherokee territory could return if they chose, and others like them could find refuge without the constant fear of discovery and removal. But the plan required something that Ezra had lost in the depths of his grief: the ability to believe in himself as a force for good rather than destruction. As dawn approached and Abigail prepared to leave with the Cherokee delegation, she faced him with the choice that would determine both their futures. "I can go to Oklahoma and live safely on the reservation," she said, holding the travel papers that guaranteed her passage. "Or I can stay here and help you build the community Martha envisioned, but I won't stay to watch you drink yourself to death. If you want me to choose love over safety, you have to choose hope over guilt." The ultimatum forced Ezra to confront the fundamental question that had haunted him since Sand Creek. Was he a man who brought death wherever he went? Or was he someone capable of nurturing life in the most unlikely places? The evidence of Martha's faith, combined with Abigail's willingness to risk everything for their shared vision, offered him a chance at redemption he had never believed possible. As the Cherokee delegation prepared to depart, Ezra made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Walking to the cabin with steadier steps than he had managed in weeks, He retrieved his remaining bottles of whiskey and smashed them against the rocks beside Mary's grave. The alcohol that had been his refuge from responsibility became an offering to the memory of everyone who had believed in his capacity for good. Martha saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, he told Abigail, as the morning light illuminated the valley where their community would rise. Maybe it's time I started looking through her eyes instead of my own. The Cherokee delegation left without Abigail, but they carried with them letters of invitation for the women who had departed, promises of sanctuary backed by substantial financial resources and legal protection. Word would spread through the network of displaced peoples that Widow's Rest Ranch had become more than a hiding place. It was now a permanent sanctuary where hope could take root and flourish. Standing together beside the graves of those who had died for their vision, Ezra and Abigail began planning a future that would honor both the dead and the living. The community that had been born in desperation would be reborn in hope, funded by love and sustained by the faith that Martha Thompson had placed in a broken soldier's capacity for healing. The curse that Ezra had carried for 31 years was finally broken, not by forgetting the past, but by embracing the possibility that even the deepest wounds could become sources of strength for others who shared similar pain. The wedding took place on October 15th, beneath a canopy of aspen trees that had turned the mountainside into a tapestry of gold and crimson. Ezra Thompson, at 67, stood beside Abigail Crow Feather, with hands that no longer trembled from guilt or whiskey, his weathered face peaceful in a way that 31 years of solitude had never achieved. Dr. Morrison officiated the ceremony, reading vows that blended Christian tradition with Choctaw customs, while the small community that had become their family witnessed the union of two souls who had found healing in each other's love. Martha's grave was decorated with wild flowers and eagle feathers, her presence felt rather than mourned, as Ezra spoke the words that released him from the past while embracing the future. "I take you as my wife," he said to Abigail, "not to replace what was lost, but to honor what endures." Love doesn't diminish when it's shared. It multiplies, like light from a single candle lighting countless others. The community that celebrated their union bore little resemblance to the desperate group of refugees who had sought shelter in a blizzard 8 months earlier. Using Martha's trust fund with careful planning and legal precision, Ezra had transformed Widow's Rest Ranch into a permanent sanctuary that operated with territorial approval and federal recognition. The original cabin had been expanded into a complex of buildings designed to house families rather than fugitives, with a school, medical clinic, and workshop spaces that generated income through craft sales and contract labor. By winter's approach, 12 families had settled permanently at what was now called Harmony Settlement. The 6 women who had left for Cherokee territory had returned with husbands and children, drawn back by letters describing opportunities that reservations could never provide. Word spread through the underground networks of displaced peoples that Colorado's mountains held a place where different cultures could coexist without surrender of identity or dignity. Ruth Standing Bear, now 18 and married to a young Ute warrior who had fought beside them during the siege, served as the settlement's liaison with other tribal communities. Her fierce spirit had mellowed into determined leadership, and her fluency in multiple languages made her invaluable in negotiations with territorial officials who still viewed the integrated community with suspicion. Clara Morningstar established the medical clinic that served not only the settlement but surrounding ranches whose inhabitants had learned to appreciate her healing skills. Her treatment of both white and indigenous patients without discrimination gradually broke down barriers that had seemed insurmountable. When she successfully delivered the baby of a rancher's wife after the town doctor had given up hope, Clara's reputation spread throughout the territory. The economic success of Harmony Settlement proved that Martha's vision extended beyond mere charity to practical sustainability. The workshop complex produced leather goods, textiles, and metalwork that commanded premium prices in Denver markets. Ezra's newfound sobriety and Abigail's business acumen created partnerships with merchants who valued quality craftsmanship over the ethnic origins of its creators. The school that Abigail established became a model for territorial education policy, teaching children in both English and their tribal languages while providing practical skills that prepared them for successful integration into the broader economy. When territorial education officials visited to investigate reports of irregular teaching methods, they found literacy rates and mathematical competency that exceeded those of conventional schools. Personal happiness flourished alongside community success. Ezra's transformation from bitter recluse to beloved patriarch seemed miraculous to those who remembered his drinking and despair. His morning visits to the cemetery became celebrations rather than mourning rituals, as he shared community news with Martha, Mary, and the others whose sacrifices had made their sanctuary possible. Abigail's influence extended far beyond their settlement's boundaries. Her correspondence with sympathetic officials in Washington helped shape federal policy toward refugee communities, while her published writings in territorial newspapers challenged prevailing attitudes about racial integration and cultural preservation. Her book, Bridges of Understanding, A Testament to American Possibility, became required reading and teacher training programs across the territory. The couple's own relationship deepened through shared purpose and mutual respect. Their evening conversations, once tentative explorations of growing attraction, evolved into planning sessions for expanding their community's reach and influence. They adopted 3 orphaned children, 2 Choctaw boys and a white girl whose parents had died in a mining accident, raising them as siblings in a household where multiple languages and traditions created richness rather than confusion. Spring of 1887 brought validation of everything they had built when Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford visited Harmony Settlement for its 5th anniversary celebration. The same official who had once signed removal orders now proclaimed their community a shining example of American ingenuity and cooperation, while photographers from Denver newspapers documented the integrated schools, thriving businesses, and peaceful coexistence that had seemed impossible just years earlier. Standing on the porch where he had once counted snowflakes for company, Ezra watched children of various backgrounds playing together in the yard while their parents worked side by side in the workshops and gardens. The isolation that had defined 31 years of his life had been replaced by connections that extended across racial and cultural boundaries, creating something unprecedented in the American West. The community's influence rippled outward through networks of commerce, correspondence, and personal relationships. Other settlements began requesting consultation on integration policies, while federal officials studied Harmony's success as a potential model for resolving ongoing conflicts between indigenous peoples and territorial governments. Martha's trust fund, carefully managed and reinvested, had grown to support similar communities across 3 territories. As autumn painted the mountains in familiar colors, Ezra reflected on the transformation that had begun with 10 desperate women seeking shelter from a storm. The cemetery behind their home now held additional graves, community members who had lived full lives and died peacefully among people who loved them, rather than dying as refugees in unmarked graves far from home. The final vindication of their vision came when representatives from the Cherokee Nation visited to study their success, bringing official recognition from tribal governments that had initially opposed the integration model. The delegation's leader, a chief who had known Abigail's father, spoke words that summarized everything they had accomplished. "You have proven that strength comes not from separation, but from unity, that survival depends not on hiding from difference, but on embracing it." On Christmas Eve, 1887, the entire community gathered in the enlarged cabin for a celebration that blended traditions from multiple cultures into something uniquely their own. Ezra, now 72, but healthier than he had been in decades, offered a toast that captured the spirit of their achievement. 5 years ago, I was a dead man walking, counting days until my own grave claimed me. Tonight, I'm surrounded by family that extends beyond blood to embrace bonds of choice and commitment. We've proven that love is stronger than hatred, that hope can triumph over despair, that the American promise of new beginnings applies to everyone willing to work for it. As snow began to fall outside the warm cabin, Abigail added her own words to the celebration. We've built more than a community here. We've built proof that different peoples can become one people without losing what makes them unique. This is America at its best, the dream that draws people from around the world to these shores. The evening ended with children from multiple backgrounds singing carols in various languages while their parents shared stories and planned for the future. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and majestic, witnesses to a transformation that had turned a place of solitude and sorrow into a beacon of hope for anyone seeking sanctuary from a world too often divided by fear and misunderstanding. Ezra Thompson had finally found the family he had spent 31 years believing he didn't deserve, and in doing so, had created a legacy that would outlast any individual life. The man who had once spoken only to the wind now heard his words echoed in children's laughter, community meetings, and the quiet satisfaction of meaningful work shared among people who had chosen to build something beautiful together. At 67, Ezra Thompson discovered what too many of us learned too late, that our greatest wounds can become our deepest sources of strength, and that the family we choose often matters more than the one we're born into. After 31 winters of crushing loneliness, convinced he was cursed to bring tragedy to everyone he loved, Ezra found redemption not by forgetting his past, but by transforming his pain into purpose. When 10 desperate Choctaw women sought shelter at his isolated ranch, he faced a choice that would define his legacy: retreat into familiar bitterness or risk his heart one more time for people who needed him. What followed wasn't just a story of survival. It was proof that love multiplies when shared, that communities built on compassion can overcome any obstacle, and that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Ezra's transformation from broken recluse to beloved patriarch reminds us that our later years aren't about winding down. They're about stepping up. The wisdom we've earned through decades of experience, the resilience we've built through surviving life's storms. These aren't consolation prizes. They're superpowers waiting to change the world. What dreams have you put aside that might still be possible? When did you last choose hope over fear, even when the odds seemed impossible? Share your thoughts below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.